So pickleball continues to be the fastest growing sport in the U.S. And now that summer is here, more Minnesotans are going to be picking up their paddles in the coming months.
So whether you're part of a competitive league or maybe you're just a beginner looking to learn, important to know the safest way to play. Prevent those injuries. Keep yourself in the game. So our guest today, Dr. Sam Russ from Summit Orthopedics. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
So we're seeing more people play pickleball.
Absolutely.
I'm guessing we're seeing the number of injuries go up when it comes to pickleball as well.
Absolutely. There was a recent study from our Academy of Orthopedics that said that injuries are increasing about 90%. It's a crazy amount, and we're definitely seeing that at our practice at Summit.
How are they injuring themselves?
I think a lot of it is people are coming from maybe a little bit of a sedentary lifestyle.
Yeah.
Pickleball is a more higher impact sport than I think a lot of people think, and so either inappropriate equipment, preparation, and warm-up is leading to a lot of these injuries.
Are they like rolling their ankles? Are they hurting their wrists? Like what are they injuring?
Yeah, from top to bottom. I personally specialize in the lower extremities, so I see a lot of Achilles tendonitis, ankle sprains, fractures, even Achilles ruptures.
You're talking some serious stuff then here too.
But I've talked to many of my upper extremity colleagues, and they're seeing wrist fractures from people falling from diving for balls. We're seeing shoulder issues, so yeah, there can be some serious things.
Okay, maybe this is a ridiculous question. Are there certain stretches that you should do for pickleball that you may not necessarily think that you do for other sports?
So, not necessarily.
Okay.
I think a lot of it is like a general warm-up for a higher impact sport.
Yeah.
In the lower extremity, I personally think stretching the calf muscle and the Achilles is super important, quads and hamstrings. But when you're swinging that paddle, making sure that you've done some arm circles, warming up your shoulders, elbows, and wrists, I think is really important too.
So obviously, like if you're tearing your Achilles, you're out for a while, right? But what about some of these other more minor injuries? Like how long then do you need to take a break from your pickleball after that to recover?
It all depends on the injury, and I'd say that's one of the things that can be hard for our pickleballers is they want to stay on the court. And so anytime you're injured, we'd recommend taking a break, rest, ice, elevation. Depends on the injury of how long you're going to need to be out, and certainly we have urgent cares kind of across the cities who'd be happy to take a look at those injuries and give some guidance on that.
I was just going to say, so when do you need to, for example, go to a clinic? When is it next level?
Yeah, I'd say certainly no injury is too small for us to give some guidance on, especially on rehab and getting back to sport. But if you're having trouble weight bearing, if you notice significant bruising, swelling, or it's not getting better after a few days of rest, ice, and elevation, I'd say it'd be a good time to be seen.
Okay, I know you're a lower extremity guy, but you did mention one point, like just using the equipment wrong. Like, is there a right way to hold this so you're going to help yourself?
Yeah, so I am by no means an expert, but what I've learned in this for the upper extremities is instead of flicking the wrists and working really hard with the wrist and the elbow, turn the shoulders and kind of get the whole body into the swing is important.
You're playing tennis.
Yeah, that's essentially what it is.
It certainly can be. I think one thing I'd emphasize too is that Minnesotans, what we call tennis shoes or a sneaker in other parts of the country, is generally referred to as, or is generally like a running shoe or a walking shoe.
Right.
And in pickleball, when you're moving side to side, those lateral movements, something like a court shoe is
almost like a cross-training shoe, you think?
Exactly.
Or like a basketball? Like what do we...
Certainly you could wear something like a basketball shoe, but they do make specific court shoes for pickleball that give you that support. A little more grip for the court too, so that you're not slipping and sliding.
That would make sense.
This is how you know pickleball's not going anywhere anytime soon. They're making shoes for it now.
They are.
It's got to be the shoes.
All right. Doctor, thank you so much for coming in today. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.